Welcome to this super exciting session. We're going to be talking about the future of the web, whether or not it's going to be hopeful. We're going to be talking about decentralization, the blockchain, whatever is going on with crypto at the moment. But we're not going to be doing that just with me, obviously. We have two amazing guests. First up is Gavin Wood. He's a computer scientist, but also the co-founder of Ethereum. He's the founder of Parity Technologies, as well as Polkadot. And I think for this particular conversation, what is really interesting to know is he actually was the person who coined the term Web3 back in 2014. So I would like to invite Gavin up on the stage.
Thank you, Anu.
Great. Well, before Kevin and I are going to have a conversation, because we're going to be doing things a bit differently, we're going to kick it off. We're going to make sure that everyone understands what Web3 actually is, what the difference is between Web 1, Web 2, and Web 3. But then Gavin and Edward are going to have a conversation, because our next guest is a man who needs no introduction. Probably the most famous whistleblower in the world, Edward Snowden, who is, of course, most well known for, in 2013, revealing that the American government and its intelligence agencies were spying on its citizens through mass surveillance, and we're super happy to have him here virtually as well. So Gavin, to start things off on this really hot stage, I think what's really interesting is your relationship with Edward Snowden. He likes to go by Ed, I've been told. Is actually something that goes back for quite a long while. And I think what's really interesting is when you did coin Web3, which was in 2014, you actually also described it as a post-Snowden web. So I think I was really interested to learn more about to what extent did the Snowden effect, if you will, or the revelations that he did, prompt you to rethink the web and what we need to do to better run it, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a bit of a wake-up call to a lot of people, myself certainly included. The scale of surveillance and the compliance of the services that we sort of knew and oftentimes trusted was, I think, unprecedented and surprising. And it seemed to me that this, I mean, I read about it in 2013, like a lot of other people, and it seemed to me that this was a sort of a running current in society. The 2008 financial crisis had some similar themes there, with people that were trusted, oftentimes through opaque systems, not behaving according to the expectations. So in 2013, and specifically when I sort of got into Bitcoin and what was come to be known as blockchain, it was a little sort of, I guess a little Tetris piece sort of fell into shape, into place, and I figured that this was probably, an important technological innovation, something that can reduce the need to trust. And I figured that if we can generalize this to an application platform, then we have a shot at remedying some of these problems that Ed was so brave enough to point out.
Yeah. And I think when we talk about Web3, we talk about a decentralized internet, we talk about a blockchain-based internet, but I think maybe good to go back to the start of the internet. We just had Tim Berners-Lee, creator of the web. But I think, in a way, it's also a bit similar to how Web 1 was. So maybe first explain a little bit more about Web 1 and what was so great about it, and then how Web 2 ruined it a little bit for us.
Web 2 was, Web 1. This was like a decentralized information publishing system, right? Very novel for its time, like incredible innovation, that essentially allowed anybody to make information known, to effectively, as the internet sort of rolled out across the world, make it known to sort of anyone else that sort of wanted to know it and had the wherewithal to find it, to be able to use a search engine or whatever. And this was, I think, a crucial application that really brought the internet into people's minds. And in fact, for a long while, the browser was the internet. People. I remember in the mid to late 90s, it's like, is it the web or what do we call this thing? It's like, oh no, there's email, so I guess is email the web as well? Yeah. Web 2 came along. Web 2 was like, effectively, we're talking about turning this data, this information publication system, into a more general like service provision system, which allows service providers to create web pages that are effectively applications in and of themselves, generally, in almost all cases, having a back end that is controlled by the service providers. Very similar to how banks provide a service to their clients, and all of the actual banking stuff happens behind the walls of the bank. And all we get is like a sort of a counter, and we sort of say, we request, please, transfer money from here to here, and the bank has to think about it. And if they're in a good mood, maybe they'll do it.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that's probably what we need to know to start off your conversation with you and Edward. So Edward, I hope that you're here, and yeah, I will see you for the Q&A.
Okay.
Somebody doesn't want us to talk.
Seems that way.
Okay, I guess we're just not going to talk. I didn't hear the introduction, but hey, look, everybody's been waiting, so let's just do what we can here. I don't know how long the connection is going to last. It's kind of a miracle that we can do this at all when you think about it. But what I was hoping that we would talk about today is where we have come to the internet as it exists today, how it's kind of been built around us. We all depend on it now. And nobody really asked you if you wanted it to be this way. But it's assumed that you agree to it. It's assumed that this represents your will, your desires, that you are okay with the direction that things are continuing in. From the time you buy a phone to the time you take it out of a box, to the time you visit a website, you've got that click wrap agreement, that beautiful, gigantic 400-page block of legalese that none of us actually read, but you must agree to in order to use the device that you just paid for, right? It says click OK to continue. I agree. There is no next button, there is no skip button, you can't do that. And they say that's consent, they say that's agreement, but I think if we ask you right now, if you ask me, I didn't agree to this. This isn't what I wanted. These aren't rules that I think are fair, and yet alternative. Can you operate in modern society without a phone, running software from either Google or Apple? There's like 3 Linux guys in the audience that they're saying yes, but everybody else, the answer is no. All of the apps, all of the services, the way you get a cab today isn't by calling someone on the phone, it's by opening an app that doesn't really care what you want, what you agree to, how you want to use things. When we think about the financial system, the fact that the economy is melting down, the fact that interest rates are spiking up, we see inflation everywhere. It hasn't happened yet, but we're about to see more layoffs. It's the same thing. There are systems that purport to be representing our will collectively. But we used to have this idea that there was sort of like a working class, a laboring class. And then there was the ownership class, the sort of capital class. And what we see now is there is the ruling class and there's the collective underclass. And I think this is what is happening is we have seen a system that rules us more so than it represents us. Now, when we look at the origin of law of the blockchain, when we look at the origin of the internet, we were creating decentralized systems, or we were aiming to create decentralized systems where we had more of a stake, where we helped direct these systems, and we built them. If you wanted to publish something, you set up your own server, it was there. That was the read-only web, the sort of web 1.0 internet. Then we had a change in the internet where it changed in character from this cooperative, creative structure into something that was commercial and competitive, where you had industries and companies I want to say colonize this space, frankly, build their own silos, then invite people in with the idea that you owned this. You could get your own little website. You could get your own little corner of MySpace, right? When anybody used it. GeoCities, does anybody remember that? And you could not only read from the web, you could also write to it in your own small way. But you didn't own it. It was the appearance of ownership, which was distinct from the fact of ownership. In fact, these companies were saying they owned everything that you produced. You gave it freely to them. You provided a license when you clicked OK to continue. And so everything that went forward from there, you had no say in. Now, the cellular networks that we now connect to the internet from, instead of our home, lines or our own little modem or broadband connection that we had at home, the cellular network works in the same kind of way, where we have phone companies that are saying the records of your communications are not your private records. They're their private records. At one of the major sort of U.S. phone companies, AT&T, is saving all your records going back to 1987. So if you were born after 1987, any call that you ever had on their network, they kept. Your movement records, your association with the cell phone towers, as you ride the bus, as you get in a car, as you travel, on vacation, as you go to work, as you go home to lay your head down at night. Those records, they say, are theirs. They're call detail records. They're location records. And they're selling these as a service to people around the world. Now, the finance companies, of course, have done the same thing. We are supposed to have fixed this with cryptocurrencies and made it more independent. But what we are seeing right now is that, in fact, this same financializing urge, this same centralizing urge is moving into the decentralized network space. And we are repeating past mistakes. We are returning to the origin of our problems that we sought out to fix. And I know I went long there, but I was just afraid that, we're not going to get any network connection at all. It looks like it's going okay now. So let me just shut up for a minute and return to you, Gavin, and say, have you felt this at all? Like this situation that we're in today, do you agree with how we got here? Do you think it's something different? And more than that, where is it leading? If the status quo is a network that is oriented for the interests of institutions over the interests of the public, and we continue in this direction, where are we going to end up?
Yeah, so much to say. Many things that I'd like to sort of riposte there, but I think overall it's a crucial question to ask. The question is are people do we want this enough? Do we want the ability to be able to examine our world and the systems within it, whether it's looking at our natural phenomena, or whether it's looking at technological phenomena. Do we want the ability to examine it? Do we want the ability to know, to have reasonable certainty of how it will operate into the future? I mean, this is what the Enlightenment was about. It's the birthplace of science. It's we measure systems, we come up with theories, we test the theories, specifically to be able to predict the future, predict how the world will work. So we create these models. And in my mind, what you were mentioning there was it was a failure of expectations. We expected the service providers not to be spying on us, not to be collecting our information and saving it for a rainy day. And it turns out those expectations were not met. So do we care enough that these expectations should actually be met? That's the first thing. And I'm not sure we do. I think it's an open question. On the optimistic side, we didn't care whether our connection with the websites that were serving us data were HTTPS, whether they're SSL secured, up until about 2013. And then quite speedily after 2013, suddenly we cared about it a fair amount, or at least we cared about it enough that the vast majority of websites and web services that we use switched over. So I think on the optimistic side we have that. The other question that I have in my mind, okay, if we don't care enough, Will we eventually need it? And if we do eventually need it, for society not to become incredibly volatile, like the 2008 financial crisis, as that's a prime example of volatility due to a broken trust-based system, will we eventually realize that we need it before it's too late, before the volatility racks up to the point that there isn't much of a society left for us to save?
Yeah, I think there's a problem here in when you talk about perception, when you talk about do we want this, does the average person perceive the threat? And I think when we talk about that pre-2013 moment, for anybody who doesn't remember this, we're talking about sort of the revelations of global mass surveillance, the idea that governments around the world were working in concert in a conspiracy, not against foreign enemies, but against the public because they were afraid of public scandal if this was known. And in most countries, it was not legal at the time that it was sort of constructed around us. Did people know that all of your communications were being collected in this way, right? As Gavin mentions, there were specialists, there were academics, there were people who understood that technically this was possible. They could do it in a lab, the threats were there, the tools were known. But did the person riding the bus know? Does the person going to work, sort of in an ordinary office know? I think no. And in fact, we look at the media attitudes of the day, like literally up to the moment pre-2013. And the idea that there was a system of global mass surveillance where every connection you made to any website, regardless of whether you were a criminal or not, you could just be going to the newspaper to read it, was being ingested into a system in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Australia, in New Zealand, in Canada, right? And shared around and mixed and then spread out to larger communities of intelligence relationships that had names like that whole Anglo sort of alliance that I described was called the Five Eyes Network. Like it sounds like a villainous James Bond cabal, but it was real life. And the government's own classified documents are available online. You can read all about this. The media treated this possibility as a conspiracy theory because they could not see why. How could this be applied? And what I mean by this is the perception of threat is what produces the possibility of action at a mass scale. In the expert audience, in those academics, amongst those engineers, yeah, they could do something, but they had other interests. They had other problems. They couldn't see the fire too because they knew it was a potential problem, but there was no evidence that this was being industrialized on a global scale. When we got the evidence, as you said, things quickly began to change. But what threats are we missing today? And I think when we look at what's happening with not only sort of the market dislocations and the supply chains falling apart, the restrictions on human movements that arise as like these post-pandemic restrictions, everybody closes borders instantly, then you've got to install apps and like all of these different changes that did not previously have a history, a basis to be applied at this scale everywhere. And then just a few years later, you've got in China, 25 million people in the city of Shanghai who are not allowed to leave their apartments, who at times are not allowed to even order groceries. Like if you couldn't leave your apartment, if you couldn't order groceries right now, how long would you last? I think this is where we are moving toward a moment in history right now that we all feel things are going wrong. Everybody sees like the plate beginning to slip in slow motion. We're all reaching it to try to catch it. But if we had known that plate was going to fall, we would have a better chance to catch it. And I am worried that the plate is going to break. And the reason why is that we did not see how deeply, how thoroughly our digital dependence had become entrenched before institutions began to seize it as a policy lever that they could use to move us to shape our behavior. Banks are the biggest example right now where, they can cut you off at any moment. You have your money in their hands, and they're supposed to, be good stewards of it. But we have begun to see people dislocated from their accounts because of protest activity, right? Because of the movements they support. it could be the same as treating a protest, which is very disruptive and which people don't like. It might be very unpopular. The same as if it was some kind of violent extremism with weapons and like armed force and uprising. These things are not the same. But governments realize they have new tools that they've never had before. And now the public is entering a time of precarity. I think we're all realizing that there's a decline. People who are invested in the crypto market, specifically, uh, everybody is seeing like each other as competitors as opposed to cooperators. They're all trying to get out. They're all trying to sort of save themselves because they weren't focused on the utility of the networks they were building so much as the financial advantages they were deriving from it. And this is really the danger of the current times, right? Those moments of precarity, when we move from a time of plenty where everybody has so much, where nobody really cares what's happening, you can sit at home, you can watch your shows, and no one's really going to bother you unless you do something incredibly, incredibly, incredibly extreme. To a time where there are limits on what is available. There is not enough to go around for everyone. And maybe there is enough to go around for everyone in your rich country. But when the prices rise and rich nations are trying to buy up scarce supplies, right? They have the money to do that. There are other countries that go hungry. There are other countries that experience shortages because of that. One of the most powerful things about the internet to me is the fact that we have this global network that connects all of us together. And we have not yet realized that the national fabric, the national structure that we lay over top of it, all of those borders, all of those passports, are the artificial concepts that separate us from recognizing we are all one team. And as we move into these difficult times, right, without having previously anticipated and prepared for the threat, unfortunately, primarily because of short-sighted politics and political thinking, how are we going to navigate our way out of this?
So, suppose we take if we take the best case example, we don't really need to talk about that here. So let's think a little bit more cynically, skeptically. If things start to break with the volatility that we're sort of talking about, will this beautiful interconnected fabric of communication, the internet, is it going to survive? Like, are we at the point now where we can say, yeah, the internet, things can get really bad, really, really bad, but we will still have the internet? Like, should we be building the technologies that will keep us, in some sense, free, or retain these expectations that we have grown to desire, even if they're in the background, potentially even need? Or should we really be building technology on a more hardware level, on a more base level, to protect the actual fabric itself?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at how bad it can get, I mean, that's a huge scale that I think a lot of people haven't really considered. How do you get your internet connection right now? You get a subscription to a telecommunications company that sends you in the mail or gives you in a store a little SIM card, right? A subscriber identity module that you put into the side of your phone that pairs with a little chip in your phone that holds two universally unique sort of identifiers. Nobody else shares these. Your SIM holds your phone number, of course. This is part of it. But it's the individual manufacturers or individual mobile subscriber identity, the IMSI. This is what the police used to track you with using stingrays and everything like that. And then the IMEI. This is in the handset, not the SIM card. The individual mobile equipment identity. You cannot change this. It's burned in at the factory. It would be, illegal to change it if you could. This unique identifies you on the global network. And together, these things are what allow you to tell the network, I paid for service. Does it have to be structured this way? No, it doesn't. We could use some kind of anonymous tokens where you basically show the equivalent of a cryptographic proof that I paid for service, it doesn't really matter what my handset is. It doesn't really matter who I am. Here's my routing address. Here's my transient sort of phone number equivalent that can be used to find my phone for the next 7 days, for the next 7 years, whatever I paid for. That's not how it's structured. That's not how it's built. If anybody wants to remove you from the network, whether it is the corporation, whether it is the government, whether it is eventually a foreign adversary, the technological capability exists today to do that. Now, what if you didn't connect to the mobile network? What if you were trying to use like local radio links? There's this old idea of the mesh network where everybody is like in that Web 2.0 idea as it was originally envisioned, both a publisher and a subscriber. You got everybody else's feeds, everybody else's updates pushed to your phone as they walked past you. And then you passed them on to the next phone as you passed them. Of course, there's storage limitations, there's bandwidth limitations. Right now, we don't do that very well. But the problem with these wireless communications is that wireless communications are invisible to the human eye, but they are highly visible on the electronic spectrum. And when you talk about authoritarian societies, there are a lot of things they can do with this one. They could just hunt for the emitters that are sort of not authorized on the network or not allowed to do this, or using an improper protocol and just march you off to Gulag. Or in the Chinese reality of today, you just aren't allowed to go where you want to go. If you want to go to the grocery store, you have to show your cell phone that's authorized on the normal networks. It has to connect to the normal centralized government database to retrieve your centralized identity. And it has to show a code, green, yellow, red, or about whether you're allowed to enter this right now as a health code. But that could be changed for any reason, right? And if you are not green, if you're not accepted, if you're not allowed to pass, what recourse do you have? And this is what you said, do we want it enough? Right now, everybody, even who hates the internet, everybody who hates society as it exists today, think about the worst misanthrope who's, tweeting absolute vile hatreds in a darkened basement somewhere, whoever disagrees with you, who thinks the embodiment of evil, they are going online, they're going to the same place to pass their time as largely everybody else in the majority. When there is such a popularity, when there is such a dependence on a certain structure, on a certain network, how do we leave it? How do we depart it? How do we progress from it? How do we recognize that the system as it exists today is not good enough? And to recognize that it could be better, and to recognize that it should be better, and to recognize that individually and collectively we can make it better. But it will not become better unless we force that to happen. If you study the history of humanity, no government is going to reform itself. It's not going to grant that as a gift to you. It has to be fought for and it has to be won. And I don't mean violently. This can be achieved non-violently, but it will not happen simply. It will not happen without sacrifice. It will not happen without difficulty. Now ask yourself, you sitting in the room, how much more difficulty do you want to add to your plate today in an already increasingly difficult time? But if you're not willing to, look to your left and right and ask yourself which one of them is going to be willing to. And I think this is both the great challenge and the great hope of our time. We have lived through one of the greatest periods of peace in history. We have a tremendous privilege because of that. We have great education. We have a wonderful sophistication. We have access to information and to each other that no one has had anywhere at any time. And we are being asked by history in this moment right now, what are we going to do with it?
Indeed. I think we're coming towards the end of our sort of little conversational slot. I think when we're going to move to some questions from the audience / public, perhaps. I'm not sure if... am I going to get some questions?
While they get their questions together, let me just get one to you, because we haven't gotten too much back and forth. Just when I talk about all of this, I mean, you understand this. I know you disagree on many points.
but I know you also perceive the threat and the difficulty. What is the positive vision from here? You know, I talked about the fact, and I think you agree that things can be changed. We're not doomed to a dark future. What would it take to improve our situation, not just in our immediate moment, but enduringly as we look ahead, 30 years?
I think awareness is the key thing. So, in my mind, a lot of the really big bad stuff was just basically can be explained with mass ignorance, sort of systemic ignorance. The desire to trust the person or people, organization, that tells us the stuff that we want to hear. Hey, don't you worry. You don't need to worry about this. It's all good. I got it covered. You just carry on, drinking the Kool-Aid. The system's going to look after you. And, sure enough, the system will look after you reasonably well for a period of time. But if the system is fundamentally broken because beneath its lovely, glistening exterior, it's pretty corrupt, then it's not going to look after you forever. And the longer it goes on, the worse it will be when it eventually fails, because it's just going to be building and building on top of this, really bad foundation of sand. So what we have to be, in my mind, clear, like the thing that's going to rescue us is, in my mind, a degree of enlightened skepticism about the world around us. We need to examine the world around us. We need to have, the mind, if not of an out-and-out scientist, then at least, someone who's keen on looking and thinking about the systems with which they interact. And if we don't do that, if we take the lazy route, then we're kind of, it's almost like we deserve what we get, I fear that...
People get the governments they deserve.
I mean, I wouldn't like to call into any specific examples, but in my 42 years on the Earth, it does seem to make a bit of sense, that particular phrase. I think we need to, there's a great book, a guy called Richard Feynman, physicist, Nobel laureate, and this is a guy that sort of leaded a very examined life. He looked at the world around him. He may not have been an expert in everything. He was an expert in a few things. But there was a desire to understand, even on a basic level. And I think this is something that we should increasingly try to make just a part of our everyday lives, a part of how we interact with the world. I think if we do that, then we will start to think, hey, hold on, is the banks, they're a great punchbag for this sort of thing, right? Do the banks really have my interest at heart? What's in it for the bank to actually give me the service that I want? Or more importantly, if they don't provide me with the expectations I have, if they don't honor them, then are they gonna get harmed? Is there some reason why I should be able to expect that this is the case? And I think a lot of the time with these systems that we use, the ones that you sort of mentioned at the beginning, there really isn't that much credible rationale, any really good reason why these systems should work. Is there any reason why Facebook should keep on providing the service that we expect with privacy that we maybe don't expect so much anymore, but we still expect a bit. If you read their sort of privacy statement, it's pretty good reading. It's like, we take it very seriously. It's the same taking it very seriously that British Airways did with your credit cards right before they lost all of the information. Organizations do take these things seriously, but not seriously enough. They cannot possibly take it seriously enough because the fundamental technological paradigm that they're using for these systems is broken. It's based upon the notion that if you have a honeypot and you have a single trusted service provider, that they stand a chance of providing the service that you expect with no mistakes. And the reality is that they don't.
Great. Okay, I think Ed is also back again. Hi, Ed.
Sorry, I lost audio for a minute.
No worries, no worries. Happy to have you back. I think one topic that we haven't really covered also, of course, was a bit chaotic, but is the crypto crash of this week. And I guess maybe to start with Gavin, what do you make of it? You are of course, one of the biggest advocates of the blockchain, of crypto. Are we simply in a crypto winter, or is this basically the end of it? What do you think?
Well, I probably wouldn't be sat here answering the question if I thought it was the end of it. But I mean, you know, I've been around in this industry for like nearly 9 years now. I've seen a few market swings in that time. I remember, you know, early 2014, there was like a pretty big sort of crash of Bitcoin back then. I mean, you know, markets are crazy at the best of times, and at the worst of times, we have what we see now. It's I think that it's not a great indicator of the underlying value proposition, especially in crypto, where you have a lot of people who, by saying particular things, are likely to take some money out of the system. And you have a lot of other people that, you know, are missing this whole thing of, you know, do your own research. Look into the world, examine the world that you interact with. People miss this. And because they do not examine this, they don't see where the underlying value proposition is, and which supposed value propositions are actually not value propositions at all. And because people miss this difference, we end up with, you know, some degree of structural failure, and I think, you know, we've seen a symptom of that fairly recently. But just because we see a symptom of what I would say is potentially widespread, particular cynicism, particular examples of cynicism, and widespread, some degree of widespread ignorance, I don't think that it in any way reduces the argument that in the underlying technology, there is value that the world actually needs.
So a hopeful message for those of you who hold crypto.
Long term, yes.
Long term, yeah.
Long term.
Ed, do you have anything to add there, or do you have a different take on that?
Yeah, no, I think it's largely correct. What we're seeing are signs of a maturation process that has been going on since crypto has been around. I also have been using cryptocurrencies for a very long time. They played a central role in the revelations in 2013 because I actually used them as a payment method back then. And that's what I think a lot of people have missed. They see cryptocurrency primarily as an investment. And I really think that is the wrong frame to view it through. That has driven a lot of manias, has drawn a lot of sort of emotional decision making, and everybody's talking about, you know, getting rich, things going to the moon. How is that going to happen if no one is actually using these things functionally? And they work well. They work better every year for the purposes they're actually intended for. And this is one of the nice things about these crypto winter periods, is a lot of these gigantic institutions that are, you know, collecting money from these different groups and venture capital firms and making loans, and then, you know, they're rehypothecating, you know, consumer investments in a really scummy way. Is the scamminess gets washed out, and the only people that remain are the people that are actually either using these networks functionally, and so because it still works, whether the price is $60,000 or whether the price is $6, they continue to use it, or the people who are there for the long term, either to create and to build, or because they're just true believers, whatever. And it's sort of like a forest fire. When the ground has been cleared, things will grow again. It's uncomfortable and it's difficult, and unfortunately, it feels a little more necessary than it should, because we should know better. But humanity has, I think, difficulty when it comes to learning from history. We tend to continuously repeat the same mistakes, and it's painful and difficult for us to move beyond them. One more thing that I will get into on here is how we got here, where all this scamminess came from, particularly when we're talking about the most difficult in the world to create. But there is a reasonable level of complexity and difficulty in the financial thinking, in the technical thinking, how they structure these things, particularly when people are trying all of these sort of algorithmic experiments. And when we see projects that are pretty clearly money grabs or Ponzi schemes, frankly, that don't have a long-term value proposition, that don't have a reasonable enduring use, that aren't significant improvements on pre-existing systems. The question is, why are these people doing this? And when we see things like Facebook, right, where we talk about virtual reality and these new spaces, this kind of shared collective digital space that we're all relying on now, the kind of telepresence that brings me to you today, even when I can't travel, right? When the network path is clearly hostile to us having this conversation, we managed to overcome it, right? But now people are trying to occupy it. Now people are trying to derive rents from it. They're trying to own, in part, the public space rather than build in the public space. Well, Mark Zuckerberg's not doing that on his own. When we look at the history, it's frankly beyond his capabilities. He needs friends, he needs employees, he needs people who know more than him, who will share and work more, and basically give the larger creative force of their life and submit it to his direction. And it's not him specifically, right? Like there's 10,000 types like this. The creative core of the technical force, I think in the last 100 years, but especially in the last 30 years, has really changed in character from when I was a young man looking at these systems in the wild, wild internet, where to be there, you had to build the systems yourself. You had to walk through a technical gate of pain in order to participate. The only people who were there were the ones who needed to be there, who very badly, badly wanted to be there. You weren't forced to be there. You weren't required to be there in the way that you are today to participate in the modern economy. And from this sprang a tribe, the cypherpunks, as they were, the ones who eventually led to the creation of things like digital currency. And these technologists who had powerful minds and who wrote, lengthy essays on all kinds of things that were read by like 10 people on a mailing list somewhere and never seen or heard from again ever. But they were so committed, they were so passionate about changing the way the system of the world worked that they worked with peers to try and realize it. And eventually they did. What happened to them, right? And I think what we've seen is that change of culture where the technical tribe that wants to find itself in opposition to the institutions as they exist today have now submitted themselves to working for a paycheck or whatever, an equity stake, to become tools, instruments of the institutions. We have to ask ourselves how and why that happened. Why that's so attractive, why it's so recurrent, why we see so many different people from so many different origins with so many systems of belief are doing this. In Silicon Valley, you see all kinds of stories about like there's a staff sort of resistance against Google or something like that. But Google continues, and where do these people go? Who are the other 99% of people who continue working for Google? And where will we move forward from this? We need people to recognize that these systems do not exist without their participation, particularly those who are specialists, right? There are the users, and then there are the people who construct the systems around the users. And if you are in the latter camp and you are amoral and you are mercenary, right? And I'm not saying immoral here. I'm saying amoral. You simply don't care about the kind of systems that will affect the entire world. I want you to just take a moment and think of what that world that you also must live in is going to look like 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, when you too have to start showing, your green and yellow and red code from software that you made yourself.
Yeah. Okay, we have a few more seconds, so maybe a very, very short answer. But I think to connect what you just said, I think it's really interesting that we haven't really talked about one really important thing, which is convenience, right? So all of the things that we're talking about, people giving away their data, big companies taking ownership of that data, also has to do with just the fact that it's convenient, and people want to use convenient tools. And potentially I would be able to set up my own email server, if I wanted to, but I don't because it's too much work, it's too much effort. So I think for the both of you, how do you, I'm going to start with Gavin, how do you also stay hopeful, because you seem like optimistic people, the two of you, hopeful that people at some point are going to get that, or will drop that at some point for the greater good?
I think when you're building new technology, there's a certain order to things. And when you're building foundational technology, the order is pretty important. The first thing that you need to do is make sure that it's safe and secure, right? If the technology isn't safe and secure, then you're already lost. The second thing that you need to do is you need to make it functional, right? So it has to actually do something that's useful for people. People actually need to want to use it for a job that they need sorting. The third thing that you need to do is you need to make it joyous and convenient, right? That's the last thing. It is a thing that you need to do, but it's the last thing that you need to do. And it's very important that you don't do it before the other two, right? If you do it before it's functional, then you're going to just get a lot of people, they'll try it out, they'll think, oh yeah, I had a great fun using it, but I don't need to use it, so they go away again. And if you do it before the first one, then you will lose all confidence once the first major security or safety incident happens. So what we're seeing is that this new technology is first being sort of prototyped, and we're working out how safe really is this? How much value can really be stored? How many people can really when they're using it in all sorts of different circumstances, are they all having their expectations provided in an acceptable fashion? And so far, at the base level, with high quality protocols, they have been broadly successful experiments. The second thing is functionality. Now, the functionality, this is quite a big plethora of things, one of which is scalability, can enough people use it? Is it still useful when there's 1 million people using it or 1 billion people using it, rather than just 1,000 people using it? But another thing is, does it actually do anything useful in society, or is it just a toy? Is it something for technologists to play with? Now, it is my heartfelt belief that it does do something really crucially useful in effectively commoditizing away the need to trust.
Gavin, I am so sorry. Listen, that's what happens when you get passionate. You could just keep going all day long. But y'all, can you please give it up for Gavin, Ed, and Anouk? Yes, take your stage, take your bow. Ed, it was so nice meeting you as well, sir.